Okay, so the next is read only. Read only prefix is used to make a property as a read only. Read only property either need to be initialized at declaration or initialized inside the class constructor. So there are mainly two differences in read only and the constant. So the const cannot be reinitialized. In same way, read only also cannot be reinitialized, but we can initialize it in two places. One is while declaring a variable, and the second is while in our class constructor. Then second is array specific difference is there between const and the read only. When we work with array, we cannot push new elements in a read only, but in const, when we declare the array as constant, we can push elements later in our const array. Then how to use a track by function. So in our TS we'll use this track by fn method, which will take the index and actual item and will return the unique property of that item. As you see here, we have written the item dot id here, and in our template, while using the ng for structural directive, we'll use the track by property, which value is track by function, which is written in our TS file. Well, the next is pass the asynchronous input data to a child. There are two ways to pass the asynchronous data to a child, as we see here. First, fetch the async data in parent component using observable or promises. Assign it to a class member and then pass that class member to a children, as we said the input properties. Means we declare one class property, will subscribe to observable or will get the promise resolve reject in that class member, and that class member will pass as an input property to our child component. Then the second way is like we'll pass the input property as an observable to a child, as we see here in our parent component. We'll declare one private underscore data and we'll create a subject object, and then next is we'll declare the data observable, and the value will be the subject object as we created here. As we see here, we have declared this data observable, and the value is this dot underscore data dot as observable. Then in our parent template, we'll just pass that this data to our child component. This is the correct way. So we have passed this data and we have this read-only data. Then the next step is to take this passed data as a input in our child component. As we see here, at the rate input data, and this is the type of observable. And then in our constructor, we'll just subscribe to this data observable, and we'll get the async emitted values to our value from parent variable of our class. And when the data is updated, we'll just use this next method of this subject data in our parent component, as we see here. Okay, so we have declared one underscore data variable. We have declared the data dollar as a observable variable. Then we have passed it to child. When the new data is emitted, we'll calling the next method, and in our child component we'll get the past data as a observable in our child component, and we are subscribing to a new values emitted from this next method of the observable. The next is environment files. We can use different environment files for different environments like testing environment, debug environment, release environment, staging, production. So the environment file is just a simply a JSON file. We write keys of access points in a environment files such as API keys, API endpoints, domain URLs to serve static files, and so on. In a production mode, we write the production property as a true in environments JSON file. We can create our own environment file as per our requirement. We'll configure to replace the environment files in angular.json file under this configuration section of architecture. We can configure for production, test, debug, as well as staging, QA, and so on. For example, as we see here in our angular.json file under the project object, we have this configuration object, and we'll configure for debug, release, test, and in each of these modes we'll use this file replacements. So we see here it will its value is an array and it has objects, so we'll configure as replace this file to replace with this file. As we see here, suppose in our release mode we will replace this environment/environment.ts file with environment/environment.release.ts file, and the release related configurations will be in this environment.release.ts file. So the key aspects are like create a new environment file under this environments folder. Then in angular.json file under the project property we have this configuration property, and we'll configure for different modes or different environments, and under this each mode we'll use this file replacements property, which will take as a value as an array, which will have object, and object will contain replace the environment file with actual environment file at the time of executing that specific environment. Okay, so next we are going to see techniques to render large number of nodes on a page. The first is virtual scrolling, then second is manual rendering, and the third is progressive rendering. So we'll see this virtual scrolling using Angular CDK's scrolling module. This CDK scrolling module given a container and a list of items, and an item is only rendered if it's within the visible boundaries of a container. So we'll see how to do this in Angular application. First is importing this scrolling module from Angular CDK. Then second is add element, that is the CDK dash virtual dash scroll dash viewport element, and will pass the item size to how many records to show in one slot. As we see here, we have added this element cdk dash virtual dash scroll dash viewport, and we are passing the item size to show the records in one go. Then within this cdk virtual scroll viewport, we'll render the items using cdk virtual for structural directive. Instead of using ng-for, we'll use cdk virtual for. As we see here, this we are rendering the 50 divs each time using this cdk virtual for directive. It behaves same as a for ng-for. We see here start cdk virtual for, and we are rendering the items one by one. Then the next is manual rendering. We can use the div, and we'll use the ng for loop to render the list of nodes on our page. Okay, the next is progressive rendering. The concept of progressive rendering is simply to render a subset of items progressively and postpone the rendering of other items in the event loop. So this will allows us the browser to smoothly and progressively render all the items. For example, we have this create embedded view method in Angular, and we'll combine it with set interval, and in this way we can render our subset of items progressively in a web page. So we create a view for a subset of items, and then we stop the script for some millisecond, and rendering engine will render the created subset of items in our DOM. Then create the views for next batch of items, stop the script, render the views, and so on. And in this way we'll achieve the progressive rendering. We'll see the example here. In our build data function, we are taking the list of items and we'll take the item size. So we have assigned the 500 as a default size. Okay, so we'll assign the 0 as a current index at the time of starting. Then we have declared the set interval, and we are referring this set interval as id in our interval variable. Then we will calculate the next index from our current index plus the item size. So in this way we'll have the current index and the next index, and then we'll loop through the items from current index to the next index, and we'll use this container dot create embedded view function, and we'll pass the template, and we'll pass the context as the current object while looping through the current index to the next index. Then once we finish with this loop from current index to next index, we will change our next index, we will change our current index to the current index plus the item size, and again this will goes to the our execution. Then again it will calculate the next index from our current index, and it will keep rendering the batch of items as you see here. And once the list is finished, we will clear this interval, which is referred in interval variable. In this way we can achieve the progressive rendering in Angular. Okay, so the summary of this function, we'll see we have defined the one function which will take the number of which will take the list of items and the item size. In that function, we'll start with the 0th index as a current index. Then we have declared the set interval. We are referring that set interval in a variable. So we are referring this interval in a variable. Once we finish the rendering, we'll clear the interval, and in interval we'll calculate the next index by adding the item size in our current index. Then we'll loop through the uh, items starting from the current index to the next index, and if the uh, index is greater than or equal to our list's length, we'll just clear that interval. And then we'll create embedded view